Где же был?
Прошу.
Тебе это
Так не
беспокоит?
подойдет, потому что мне нужно будет следить за камерой. Я боюсь уничтожить тебя уши. Здравствуйте.
Марина.
Ой, смотрите, кто тут.
Привет. 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 Смотрите, здесь хорошая детская фоточка.
Давайте я повешу гардеробную.
Смотрите, наверное, вы любите.
Понимаешь?
Такие хорошие.
Понимаешь?
У нас есть один.
Она лежит
И уже
Чего?
мне она
Лежит?
подбегает.
Как-то динамично.
Там такое смешное фото очень.
Да.
Хочешь, Жень?
Спасибо, я потом.
Угощай.
У нас есть специи в поход идет. Это как?
Пацанов в походе у меня как раз нету.
Я не поняла ее.
Павел,
Он
отсутствует.
говорит, это вот, ты раньше ходил в поход, а потом, оказывается, это он знал.
Интересуется
Я не поняла, почему.
Большое твое внимание.
Я думаю,
Они
что
поставили
не
по
по этой причине.
Что-то не знаю.
Вот это у тебя перцем идет в поход.
Да, вот
У
это.
меня есть, знаешь, какой вот перцем. Подожди, вот это сюда перцем надо, видишь? Как Финдус потерялся. У меня есть вот это очень смешная. Как он потерялся, смотрите. Он сидит, вот, смотрите, он
Are you joining us for the book club tonight?
Oh, no, sorry, я забыла.
Oh, it's totally fine to browse. We're gonna start like in about 10 minutes.
Ну,
Хорошо.
собственно, он говорит,
Покажи интересно. Can use.
Okay, hold on one second.
If you like to be in use, come.
Большой хулиганистый.
Да. Вот еще. А ты поставь куда-нибудь как мусор, чтобы он был.
Да, хотите что-то спросить?
Нет,
Нет.
Я
Если что,
Саша.
спрашивайте, не волнуйтесь.
Ты уже идешь, Мила, да?
Да, я уже второй.
Ты второй класс идешь.
Я
Это
закончила.
моя жена.
Как ты закончила второй класс?
Это
Подожди.
мой друг Дуглас.
О,
Да,
правильно говорить, это
он у нас в
Дуглас.
гостях, Кармель. Вот, смотри его, смотри.
Мы сегодня с Синой и
Посмотри, правильно, да?
Сашей
Как тревожно, правильно?
спектакль.
Это держи, возьми руку. Это
Вы
вот.
сами делали спектакль, не шумите.
Знаете, как я ему сказал? Как я называю?
Здорово, вы просто как собрались и решили, давай
Ты заметила,
покажем, не
как его зовут?
шумите.
Да.
Они сделали
Я сказал,
кукольный,
он
а потом
фотографию.
еще сыграли.
Твои будут. Вот это тебе пример парисизма. Да? Понимаешь? О, вот автор. О, автор пришел.
Посмотри, какая тут интересная.
Ладно.
Маленького
А мне
героя.
кажется,
Настоятельно читать.
Как он растет, красивый. И в этом «Хоббите» очень красивая картинка. Эти в этом «Хоббите» такие картинки раньше не публиковали. Давай, положим.
Я начну ходить.
Правда, как зеркало?
Подожди, ты пролистала.
Варвара?
Right.
Будешь сидеть.
My son doesn't look like me like that. I'm telling you. Я сказал, что ты мне пришли фотографии мамы, я должен проверить свою память. Может, чего-то когда-то произошло?
Вообще офигенно сказала.
Где этот мусорник, о котором ты так смело? Да, спасибо.
Саша, вашу книжку.
Это почти последний. Из таких вот дискуссий последний.
Сергей, дела.
Хорошо, у вас как?
В раме. В раме.
Между тем должно быть в стенде.
Так, а как продажи?
Не знаю.
Красинка, вот ты знаешь,
Говорят, и я не
Гарри
смотрю, и не
Штейн.
спрашиваю.
Гарри Штейн, да.
Делаю вид, что я тоже не интересует вещи.
Не, ну как бы
Мне очень любопытно было вначале,
Такую,
что
вы
мне
знаете
скажете,
историю?
мы тебе не скажем, так
Равенство.
скажем.
Он уже выписался. Он уже
чтобы не менялось.
Знаю,
Там такие, у меня
знаю, почему.
как он вышел, он уже
По-разному.
Гарри
Это
тебя книга.
некоторые
Первая
издатели
книга.
говорят, у некоторых даже есть
Вот
портал,
такой.
можешь сам зайти, сам посмотреть. Но это все по-разному.
А, вот такой вот. Кто-то на него
Раз первый класс.
кричал, он боялся,
Если
он
вы
думал, что там кто-то на него нападает. Ваня. Эту? Давай посмотрим.
Саша, нельзя это кодировать?
Это книжка. Пушкин дом. Мы собираемся ставить Пушкин дом. Если можешь почитать, на какой читать, может быть, будет интересно. Ты знаешь Пушкин дом? Ну вот. Выйдет Пушкин на прогулку.
Да, как раз вот доходит.
Да, как раз начали, а потом
Да, 2 месяца походили, и пандемия. Да, с тех пор как-то вот это не было.
Я сегодня купить книжку еще для моих.
мне очень нравится.
Да мне
Да, страницы, да.
Вот сидеть за камерой.
Хотите купить книжку?
Для моей подружки. Ну, в смысле, знакомая, которая она такая очень заинтересована. Я ей сказала, что ей она не понимает. Она сказала, что она не может очень прочитала. Я выбросила на Оле Зебера, уже увидела. Я думаю, что они познакомились, она мне помогала нашу первую разгадать.
Да.
Она уже ваши фанатки еще не
Белорусский товарищ.
Да, вчера тоже мне как это не пошли.
Она будет, да. Когда будет включаться, у нас будет звук нажать.
Я там еще одна из художников.
Да, если вы нажимаете, разную штучку.
Вот.
Она записывает.
И там я наткнулась на
Ну, еще раз.
которую я
Анастасия,
знаю,
вы не
Варю.
будете участвовать?
А с ней можно как-то жить,
Буду.
как ей
Но
место.
не как кинооператор.
Что-то там нас представила.
Не совсем удобно. Я вот тебе
Да-да-да.
тут напротив Саши,
Еще
я
тоже от Оли. Короче, Оля как-то там такой.
Почему?
Я настаивал на том, чтобы
Олег, здравствуйте.
Это красиво.
6 часов.
Да.
Классно.
Господи, такой план на пятницу.
У меня много планов. В части,
Успейте, я
ты
вижу.
входишь в часть в этих планов.
Очень хорошо. Это будет ваше место.
это еще значит, это самое.
В машине каждый день возили,
До сих
возили.
пор это еще надо.
3 раза забыла.
И давайте, наверное, потихонечку рассаживаться. Не то, чтобы мы очень пунктуальны все. Да. Ну, я там не почему продакшн, что все пройдет. Представить тебя, скажем, почему мы решили вот, и начнем, наверное, с чтения. Так, да, еще. Как хочешь, лучше попробовать на вкус, как говорится, текст. А после этого перейти к вопросам-ответам.
Хочешь, чтобы я оба подряд? Мне кажется,
Я не знаю. Ты можешь... Мы можем вообще не читать, можно читать, например, пока один, и как тебе удобно. То есть за него такие остренькие.
Да. Я сегодня там очень долго корректирую, сам как мне как-то хочется уже включить.
Да-да. Обычно я спрашиваю, ты знаешь аудиторию, если у них есть вопросы, если нет вопросов, нет, мы не всегда сильно. Кому проведет.
Да, я подумала, в каком момент сказать, что
Я тебе покажу.
организовано.
Мы можем с этого начать, собственно говоря. Я передам тебе слово, и ты расскажешь о книге, а потом, если ты хочешь читать экстракт, читаем экстракт, и мы сразу двинемся посмотреть.
Есть дискуссия.
Подойдет?
Я, наверное, да, чуть-чуть лес, как-то начну, зачем?
Да.
Был бы
Я просто не сильно англоязычная, я читала как самое начало.
Первый кого?
Да.
Right.
Потом как просто
Да. Ну, в таком ключе мы тоже приведем.
даже, не, ну, наверное, я дальше не ставлю.
Я его спросил, я сказал, что пришли мало фотографий для доклеения, потому что требуется.
Так, ну, очень практику. Все в порядке.
Большой вопрос, я видел, я писал Иван, и говорил, что я спонсор Джорджа. И там я пришел как парень. Ты пойдешь с нами или ты пойдешь? Если я тебе это рассказывал, поверить нельзя, он больше не получил. Это тревожно.
Да, вы просто уже хотите занимать.
Что, будем начинать?
Да, уже пора бы. Борис волнуется, мы опаздываем.
Да, скажет, конечно, да.
Не знаю, мы пришли смотреть на
Чья-то сумочка. Минуточку внимания. Это ваша?
Let's go. Что у нас было? Ну, мне кажется,
Ты будешь жевать, посмотри, сколько
да,
набралось.
да,
Это моя мама еще тихо жевать в углу.
да.
Ученик. А я ему сказал, что же я ему сказал? А, ты знаешь, что были очень важные выборы у одного из наших соседей. В Мексике были. Надо начинать. Это малая не знает, что в Мексике были выборы. Right. А фамилия? Золотой ребенок. Я ее должен удочерить. А как зовут? Это нам не по плечу. А что мы знаем о Мексике? С точки зрения католицизма. С точки зрения. Почему? Еще? Я знаю. Я ваше поколение. Мексика. Сейчас ты увидишь, почему я это говорю.
Всякий раз. Мы будем начинать через минуточку. Пожалуйста, дайте знать, кто не говорит, не понимает английский язык сегодня. Здравствуйте. Alright, just in case, I want to double check. Are there anyone who doesn't speak Russian? Does not speak Russian. Great. So as announced, we're going to have a bilingual event, and probably it would be more convenient if I'll give like a chunk of information and then we'll translate. So please tune your ears up to foreign language tonight. Thank you for coming, by the way. All right, so good evening and welcome to Globus Books. I truly, deeply appreciate your support. Trust me, it means a lot for a tiny independent bookstore like us. Couple of things I'd like to take care of before we begin. First and foremost, please let's make sure our phones are silenced. Пожалуйста, давайте убедимся, что наши телефоны переключены на беззвучный режим. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Борис, что такое?
Я пытаюсь.
Thank you. We are live streaming this event on our YouTube channel, Globus Books. This video will be available for viewing, for comments, for liking, of course, for sharing with friends. Please, let's help more people to learn about our wonderful events, and in particular, this debut novel we're going to discuss tonight. Our viewers online, please feel free to submit your questions via chat. We'll try to read them tonight. Мы ведем прямую трансляцию в YouTube на нашем канале. Видео будет доступно для пересмотров, лайков, комментариев, отсылки друзьям. Пожалуйста, поможем как можно большему количеству людей узнать о наших мероприятиях и о новом романе, о котором пойдет сегодня речь. Сохраним пока интригу. Наши зрители, пожалуйста, задавайте вопросы в чат, и мы по возможности будем их озвучивать. So, if you have any questions about Globus, book ordering, etc., please address the questions to me. My name is Anastasia. I'll be more than happy to help. Otherwise, we'll be starting the event. And I think we'll begin with some book introduction by the author, followed by some reading. This book exists only in English version for right now, but we prepared a couple extracts translated into Russian, just to give you the taste of the novel. Then we'll have Q&A, and here a quick reminder, do not yell a question and do not interrupt your fellow reader. Raise your hand and me or Sasha will invite you. And we will wrap up the night with a book signing, of course, and informal tea drinking. Yes. Yeah, we're going to make some more space. Don't worry about it. So, пожалуйста, есть какие-то вопросы? Я по-прежнему Анастасия. С удовольствием постараюсь вам помочь. Начнем мы вечер с представления о книге. Затем будут вопросы и ответы. Здесь мы помним, что мы с места не выкрикиваем. Поднимаем руку, мы вас приглашаем. Завершим вечер автограф-сессией, неформальным чаепитием. Well, I'm extremely humbled and honored to welcome and to introduce to you our fellow San Franciscan journalist, multiple award winners, quite professional, I should say, with words in such major media like New York Times, LA Times, Harper Bazaar, PQD, The Atlantic, and many others. She's an amazing mom who's raising another generation of multilingual readers. She's a writer and an immigrant herself. Please welcome Sasha Vasilyuk. Мне безумно волнительно и приятно приветствовать и представлять для вас сегодня Сашу. Саша наша с вами землячка по Сан-Франциско. Она чудесная мама, которая воспитывает следующее поколение читателей. Профессиональный журналист со множеством наград и публикациями в таких крупных медиа, как New York Times, Los Angeles Times, CNN, Harper Bazaar, Atlantic, многие другие. Она писатель и к тому же еще иммигрант.
Самое главное.
Не самое, но я думаю, что с выходом этой книги может быть существенное. Tonight we'll be reading from and discussing her debut novel, Your Presence is Mandatory. This book is based on real historical events and some major family secret. This book was released to the world in late April of this year, but nevertheless, Sasha already wrapped up the American tour and met a lot of her readers. But tonight, by all means, is very special. Tonight marks the first time this book will be presented both in Russian and English. It was important for us to create the space for discussion and safe environment for sharing among our multilingual immigrant community. People who moved from late Soviet Union or territories, former Soviet Union territories, not only, most likely have first-hand experience of those events that Sasha writes in her book about. Some of them or their family members lived through those events or had similar experiences. And we're very eager to hear the contributions from our immigrant community. So with that said, Sasha, please give us a little bit of introduction of your book.
Okay.
Thank you.
Я начну по-русски, и еще раз я могу спросить, кто здесь по-английски либо не понимает, либо так плохо понимает, чтобы я... Или мы все понимаем хорошо по-английски. Можно. Okay, хорошо. Так что я представляю. Значит, мы вот с Анастасией сделали такой перевод, пару кусочков книжки. Для меня это был очень необычный какой-то опыт, потому что кажется, что легко переводить свой собственный текст на один из языков, на котором ты говоришь, что, собственно, родился. Но это не так, узнала я сегодня утром. Вот, в общем, как-то меня это поразило, и я теперь об этом очень думаю. Так что спасибо, Анастасия, что она мне с переводом помогла. Обычно я вот на этих, за последние 1,5 месяца, я читаю такой укращенный вариант первой главы, чтобы, как-то так легче. Но сегодня мы все будем делать не так, как обычно, все по-другому, специально для вас. Вот, я скажу только для начала о книжке то, прочитаю одну фразу из вот этого документа. Это письмо, которым, вот видите, 1,5 странички, которое мой дедушка, украинский еврей, живущий в Донецке, он умер в 2007 году, и через несколько недель после этого моя бабушка случайно наткнулась на вот этот документ. Это письмо адресовано КГБ, написано в 1984 году, когда мне был 1 годик, в котором дедушка, про которого мы знали, то есть мы про него знали много, нам так казалось, но он о том, как он воевал и что он делал во время войны, мы знали практически ничего. Как, я думаю, часто бывает, может быть, даже со многими из вас. Мы знали, что он воевал и что он дошел до Берлина. Вот всегда звучала вот эта вот «дошел до Берлина» фраза, которая подразумевала, что он такой, какой-то такой war hero, скажем, да. А потом обнаруживается такое письмо, в котором оказывается, что все было совсем не так. И я вам скажу, я прям полностью не буду его описывать, но он был военнопленным, и он стал очень рано, прям через месяц буквально. А потом это скрывал, соответственно, от нас, от его семьи и от государства до 1984 года, когда КГБ каким-то образом не обнаружило, что что-то там у него не то. Вот. И он написал объяснение, что же на самом деле он там во время войны делал. Заканчивается оно этой фразой. Okay, then I'll stop so you can translate. Or I can translate, actually. Заканчивается оно так. Он там рассказывает, что он где был, как он это укрыл и почему. И потом: дети и внуки мои очень меня любят, и было бы большой психологической травмой для них знать то, о чем я сообщил. Вот такая фраза, которая для меня стала какой-то ключевой, наверное, в этой книге. I'm gonna speak in English for a little bit. So this book began for me when my grandfather, who was a Ukrainian Jew, he passed away in 2007. He was a war hero who never talked about the war. And it was sort of, we were never not that we weren't allowed to ask, but it was presumed that we wouldn't. But we knew that he fought the entire war from its first day until its last, which was rare in a country that lost 27 million people. And it made him kind of a war hero, essentially. Then he passes away in 2007, and my grandmother finds this letter that I was showing, which is very short, and it's his confession to the KGB, written in the 80s, that describes what really happened to him during World War II, which began when he was captured very early in the war. And as a Jewish man, he managed to survive in Germany for 4 years in various ways and had lots of adventures. But the letter ends on this phrase that is in the first chapter of the book, which says, "I'm writing to address inconsistencies discovered in my military service record. However, I must first say that my children and grandchildren love me very much, and it would be a big psychological trauma for them to find out what I'm about to report." Which is sort of the central phrase around which kind of the book was built and my interest in it. Для тех, кто говорит на обоих языках, вы, наверное, может быть, обратили внимание, что есть маленькая разница между этими фразами. Да? В одном это то, как заканчивается письмо. Я, так как это роман, а не документальный какой-то проект, я переделала так, что с этого все и начинается. Да? Что мы еще не знаем, что произойдет, но вот такой хук, как говорят американцы. Вот. Так.
Should we read?
Теперь, so I think I'm gonna read. Yeah, I'm gonna read a little passage. Maybe I'll do it in English first. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Absolutely.
I don't know what I'm doing here. In 2 languages, it's kind of hard. This is not a passage I've read to anyone before, so bear with me. And she picked it, so it's not my fault. The setup is, so our main character's name is Yefim. And the book is structured in 2 timelines. One is during the war, and we only see Yefim and what happens to him. And it alternates with chapters that are, this is my war and peace structure. So the peace chapters, which happen between World War II and the current war. And those are told from multiple perspectives, some from Yefim's, some from his wife, his 2 children, and then there's a granddaughter that appears in the 90s. And because it covers so many decades, kind of people grow up and things happen to them. Okay, but this passage is from the war part, and this is the very, very beginning of the war. We're in July 1941, and he and a bunch of other Soviet soldiers. So Yefim he was an artilleryman stationed on the border between Soviet Union and Germany on the eve of the war. Then the Germans attack. There's a fighting scene that doesn't end very well for him. He loses pieces of his fingers. And then he and a small platoon are running away east, so toward Latvia. And just before this scene, they were attacked by partisans who are, so these are Lithuanians, right, Lithuanians, and they are basically pro-German or anti-Soviet. And one of them was left to sort of to die. After the grave, but they also lost one of their men. Sorry, this required a long setup. After the grave was ready, Lieutenant Komarov took out Gurov's military ID, but left the photograph of his wife in his pocket. They placed his body into the fresh earth while trying to ignore the Lithuanians' continued whimpering in the background. "Goodbye, mate," Komarov said. "The motherland thanks you." They threw a fistful of earth and pine needles on top of the body. Then they headed east toward the Latvian border. "Watch for any movement from the north," Komarov told them. "I have a feeling we aren't done with the Balts for today." Soon the moans of the partisan faded, replaced by the silence of the forest. They didn't talk much, and every crunch of a branch made them clutch their rifles tighter. Yefim had trouble getting used to walking behind Pantuk's thin frame. With Gurov gone, he worried they were doomed. His neck ached from tension, and he couldn't stop thinking about the partisan calling him a Russian shit. He kept imagining what he could have told them if the guy wasn't on the ground bleeding to death. If instead they'd met on the street, say. Efim was sure he was on the right side in this war, but if the Lithuanians couldn't see it, he could have explained how they, the Soviets, were trying to build something that would ultimately be better for everyone, Lithuanians too. And yes, that dream came with sacrifices, sometimes great ones, like the war between Reds and Whites, the famine, the frightening winter nights in 1937 when he'd hear a car pull up and wonder if they'd come for his parents, only to learn, gratefully, that it was one of his neighbors who was taken to the camps. But at least the price they'd all paid was for a brighter future of equality. And in Germany instead, the world was a serving platter for the master race, and at any moment, officers with swastika armbands could parade you like a zoo animal with Jude smeared across your chest. Yet the more he imagined their argument, the more something in it bothered him. He couldn't forget the hate on the pale face of the dying partisan. To have such conviction against the USSR of all things seemed inexplicable. He remembered how, during the famine, he overheard his neighbors saying that Moscow was deliberately starving Ukrainian peasants to death, that they never should have become Soviet. They'd said it with the same kind of hate, and it had shocked him into tears. He remembered how he had run to Mikhail, this was his brother, who told him never to repeat it. Communism was good for the Jews, he said, good for everyone, because even though he, Efim, was born a poor peasant, he could become anything he wanted. Читаем по-русски. Where should I put that? Here we go. One thing I'll noted today about translating for people who are familiar with some of the events is that I noticed that I had to put things for kind of the Western reader that like any Soviet-born person would know. And I always had to find a balance between doing that, like explaining enough so that the Western audience understands, but not over-explaining so that it's like totally, unreadable for a Soviet-born reader. And as I was kind of retranslating it, or not retranslating it, translating back to Russian, I found myself cutting things out a little bit, not too much, but a bit, which was kind of interesting. Because I was like, well, they already know this. Like, I don't need to add adjectives to explain what things are. Anyway. Я прочитала этот кусочек, мне было очень интересно его переводить. У меня есть человек, который живет, дальняя родственница, который живет в Москве, это единственный человек, оставшийся в моей семье в России на сегодняшний момент. И она говорит, а ты что, ты как Набоков, переведи всю книгу сама. Вот. И теперь я как бы и сразу сказала, что да нет, что там, 320 страниц, и вообще я тут с 13 лет, у меня русский уже такой. Но теперь у меня есть доказательства, почему я этого не буду точно делать. Глава 4. Так, значит, Комаров вынул военное удостоверение Гурова, оставив при нем лишь фото жены. Когда могила была готова, тело уложили в сырую землю. «Прощай, боевой друг», — сказал Комаров, — «Родина тебя не забудет». На тело посыпались горсти земли с сосновыми иголками. Медленно они двинулись на восток латвийской границы. «Следите за малейшим движением с севера», — скомандовал Комаров. «Думаю, с прибалтами мы еще на сегодня не покончили». Они продолжали движение, и вскоре стоны партизана сменились тишиной леса. Шли молча, при каждом хрусте сухой ветки, невольно крепче хватаясь за винтовки. Ефим шел за Понтяком, ему никак не удавалось привыкнуть к его худощавой фигуре. Ему казалось, что со смертью Гурова они были обречены. От напряжения свело шею, и из головы все не шла фраза, брошенная ему литовским партизаном: «Русское говно». Ефим все думал, что бы он ему ответил, если бы тот не стекал на земле кровью. Если бы, например, они встретились на улице. Ефим ни на секунду не сомневался, что воюет за правое дело. Если литовец этого не понимает, он бы ему объяснил, как они, советский народ, не жалея сил, строят новое светлое будущее для всех, в том числе и для прибалтов. Конечно, путь к мечте не обходится без жертв. Иногда даже таких, как гражданская война, голод, те страшные ночи зимой 37-го, когда подъезжал черный ворон, и ты замирал, думая, только бы не родители, а потом вздыхал с облегчением, когда увозили соседей. Но, по крайней мере, советские люди понимают, что жертвуют не просто так, что это цена светлого будущего, где все будут равны. В то время как Германия настолько заигралась в высшую расу, что офицеры со свастикой на рукаве в любой момент могут протащить тебя по улице с надписью «Жид» на груди. Чем больше Ефим думал об умирающем партизане, тем больше понимал, что его так поразил в этом человеке. Нестерпимая ненависть к Ефиму и всему советскому. И он никак не мог себе это объяснить. Он вспомнил, как во времена голода он подслушал, как соседи сказали, что Москва их намеренно морит с голоду, что Москва намеренно морит с голоду украинских крестьян, и что Украина не должна была стать частью Союза. Они говорили это с такой же ярой ненавистью. Ефим тогда в слезах прибежал к старшему брату Мише, но тот строго наказал никогда не повторять услышанное. Он объяснил, что евреям при коммунизме хорошо, да и всем хорошо, потому что, несмотря на то, что Ефим был крестьянином, он, когда вырастет, может стать кем хочет. Вот какой-то такой перевод получился у нас. Это неофициальный.
Проба пера.
Да. И на русском я не пишу уже очень много лет. Telling them that it was strange to translate it and that I kept cutting things or changing things a little bit. And that I actually haven't written in Russian in a long time. I used to, but like literally it's been 20 years maybe. So that was weird. It was even weird reading it right now, but kind of fun. Let's see, what else can I say about the book? So I guess it had maybe I'll add also that the book had a very strange journey. So I did not begin I did not begin writing it in 2007 when the grandpa passed away and the letter was found. But I did at that moment think to myself, I think there's a novel there. Like it had inherently interesting plot sort of things, right? There's a person who's Jewish, who's surviving in Germany, that has all these adventures. But there's a second question about it that interested me probably even more, which is the hiding of it part. So what's it like to hide something about yourself for such a long time? Kind of how you absorb it into yourself. At which point are you doing it to protect others? And at which point are you doing it because you're really protecting yourself? So let's say, right, like when the Soviet Union does fall apart, but you're still not revealing something that isn't anymore, that's not dangerous to you or your family anymore, then why are you doing it? So for me, this was interesting because of the power that shame and fear have on a person in general, and on a person from the Soviet society, where I think it was a very common experience. Fear and shame were inherently a part of a lot of us, and I think even of us, like our younger generation. So these are kind of the two questions that are driving the book. Kind of how does he manage to survive given a lot of odds against him, and why does he hide it, and what effect it has on him and his family, on the people around him. Let's see, that's some introduction. The book ends in 2015, and it ends so Yefim was already dead by then because he had already died in the beginning, and it has this kind of circular structure in my mind. But the story begins. It's being it opens with Nina, his wife, who's the one who finds this letter and starts reading it, and it ends with her in 2015 because she is still alive and there's a new war on. So I really wanted to connect these two wars because in my mind they're very connected, and I think a lot of people from that part of the world understand how they're connected, but maybe not. We can talk about it. But I don't think it's obvious at all to Western readers. It's also something that's not covered in the media, kind of that connection, and how much World War II is being used by Putin's regime to kind of as a weapon to help with this new war effort, and how that's very twisted for anybody whose family's from there. Please don't make me say all that in Russian. I
mean,
now I don't even remember what
If
I
our
said.
audience understood, there's absolutely no need to translate it or
Okay.
repeat it in Russian.
If
So,
anybody wants to
yeah.
check.
How old was he when war started?
So he is, I think 18, 19. Yeah, he's young. He was in the army a year beforehand, and now he's literally kind of on very much the border. And another interesting connection, right? So like none of us were alive in World War II. And none of us, I assume, experienced a war in the same way that like a current one that we have. And I remember when so like the week before this war, the full scale invasion was happening. There was a lot of discussion about, right, like all the Russians were right there on the border, and it seemed very obvious. Looking back on it now, doesn't it seem obvious that of course they would have attacked?
Yeah, but I don't want to believe it.
And yet nobody wanted to believe it. Even Zelensky didn't want to believe it. We have in the audience a mom of a friend of mine who was a very well-known journalist, and he was sitting in my kitchen 2 days before the war telling me it's not going to happen.
It's not possible.
And this was actually when I was researching World War II, it was kind of the exact same scenario, which looking back on it is very hard to understand. Like, how could you not see it? Hitler was right there, like building he had a huge army. Why wouldn't he attack Soviet Union? And yet, it was both like people seemed to both expect it and not believe that it would be possible at all.
Yeah, spoiler alert, the book has a little extract of, I think, Beam's and Ivan's conversation when I think Beam is trying to persuade Ivan that the war between Germans and Soviets is not possible because for that and that reason,
Yes.
which is true, was happening. I just don't want to give up all those juicy moments because it's very dynamic novel and it covers a lot of controversial things that happen in our history, and lots of questions that probably will never have like a certain answer. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like how much, there's constantly this debate, like how much did Stalin know? Why, and given what he knew, why wasn't he prepared? Why the Soviet army was losing terribly for the first several months, losing millions of people. So these are some stats that are fun to know. So I'll share them. There are slightly less than 6 million Soviet POWs captured by Germans. And more than half of them, so 3.2 million of them were killed. And they were killed on purpose. They were not like accidentally killed. It was very much a purposeful action. And I don't think this is something that it's certainly not known at all, like in the rest of the world, but it is also weird. What's weird about it is that I don't think it's very well known in the Soviet Union. And part of the reason I think I didn't know about it, I mean, other than being young and living partly here, but it's not something that's covered. Like you don't read about it in a textbook in Russia or Ukraine, maybe. And so POWs and two other categories of people seem to just have been kind of erased from history. So Ostarbaitas, which is another type of kind of situation that I cover in the book. These Ostarbeitas is a German word for Eastern worker. So these were civilians that were captured and dragged to Germany for work purposes. A lot of them were women. A lot of them were very young women, so 16. And as the war got worse for the German side, they became younger and younger, all the way to 10-year-olds that were just caught in the streets and dragged to Germany. So a lot of them were, some of them worked very closely with Germans, like they were nannies for German kids, for instance. Someone worked in farms and factories, whatever, different situation. I think there are also about 3 million of this category of people, right? So like these are huge numbers of people. And then there's, of course, the third category that's also kind of covered in the book through Nina's story, is all the people that lived under German occupation. So, for example, the entire country of Ukraine was occupied by Germany for 2 years, and they lived, people who didn't evacuate for whatever reason and stayed, such as Nina, who was an orphan and she had nowhere else to go. When the Red Army recaptured that territory, and then later when the war ended in Europe, they were, all of these three categories of people were treated by the Soviet government as second-class citizens. And it's interesting because I have to explain this concept to Western people, because they just don't really understand how, like, why. It makes no sense, right? POWs in America are treated just like any other veterans. There's a lot of respect, right? They're kind of absolutely equal to anybody who did fight. But in Russian, we have this lovely word "отсиделся," which it's like hard to translate. It's like you sat out the war. It's kind of what is told about you if you were captured. And it does not matter that it was not your fault. Like, that's not the point, right? And that alone is very strange. That like what your role in the situation was not the point. The point was that you were exposed to the enemy for a prolonged period of time. Thus, you were not to be trusted because you could have been a collaborator, for instance, or you were no longer a fully trusted individual. And it wasn't a situation that was true during the war, which I think during the war now I'm seeing it play out in person. We all probably do, where there's a lot of distrust, right? Like from both sides to each other. I mean, from Ukrainians to Russians, Russians to Ukrainians, and a lot of paranoia. And that's part of the war. But it's interesting to me that with World War II and given the Soviet regime, that distrust followed these people, these millions of people that I just mentioned, for the rest of their life. So there was a mark in their record that stigmatized them, and it told anybody who would look at their records, such like as employers or as admissions officers in a university, that guess what? These people are not maybe fully, reliable, right? And then for the rest of your life, so you're already 70, right? But as long as the Soviet Union existed, you had this record. Every time you applied for a job, you had to fill out this lovely form. This form existed all the way until 1994, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it's in the book, where it's like a questions about your biography. And there's questions, even in the 90s, there's questions. Where were you during World War II? Were you ever captured, or are you related to anybody ever captured? Imagine, it's so bizarre, right? So I think it's interesting. It was interesting to me how little I knew, and I wanted to understand why I knew so little. And I think the answer is that it was on purpose. The government of the country where I lived, you didn't mention, but I was born in Ukraine, and then we moved to Russia when I was 6. And then we moved here when I was 13, so I spent half my childhood in one or the other. But the government there isn't really interested in kind of the nuance of the war. And I think this is maybe common in many empires. I think nuance is is not a thing that big historians that are very much eager to tell a state history from top down kind of care about. Maybe America's working on it, but Soviet Union never wanted that for sure. So all of these people got left out on kind of in the state history. But what's weird about it, and I think very unique to the Soviet experience, is that these things also got left out of the private histories. So the histories that were told by people we know closely, right? By friends and family. My grandfather not telling us that he was a prisoner of war at first I thought that's like a unique situation. And the more I researched the book and the more I now talk to people, I realized how that was actually very, very common. And the majority, I'd say a huge majority of these Ostarbiters, POWs, never talked about it to their wives, husbands, kids, because they were ashamed and because their government told them to be ashamed.
I would also.
And now I'm going to stop talking because that was very many words.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I just want to say that again, they were scared not for themselves but for their families and the consequences their families might face because of their unfortunates. I don't know if you figured it out for yourself. All those questions you were trying to understand or research with your book, but how closely is it based on your grandfather's letter, and how much do you actually know about his capture, him being captured back in Germany, and
Sure.
how? And I'm also very curious about your grandma's memoir, because I know your grandma has a memoir,
Yeah.
and it just gives me a feeling that, thanks for sharing on Instagram, that she actually contributed a lot in terms of memories, like after war, like aftermath, after the
Yeah.
war.
So the reason this is a novel and not a piece of nonfiction is because this is all I had on Grandpa. Not very much, right? It's kind of hard to write a whole nonfictional book based on this. This has a lot of I was there, and then I was there, and then I was captured, and then I was there, and then I was someplace. I don't really remember what it was called. It's a little bit like that, right? This letter is written 40 years after the events, and I find it 30 years afterward, and the main source is dead, right? And nobody around him knew about it either, right? So they can't tell me anything. So I immediately knew the only way to make the story come alive is fictionalize it. And I always wanted to write a novel anyway, so it kind of made sense. But I actually started saying something earlier. So this letter was found in 2007, and I didn't start writing the book for 10 years. And reason being, in 2007, the world looked quite different than it does today. And it didn't, I lived in America, I was doing other things, but I was also like, who needs another World War II story about a soldier? And, Americans won't want to read about Soviet stuff. Like, it just seemed very non-urgent and kind of irrelevant in 2007. And then fast forward to 2014, and the city of Donetsk, where my dad's family is from, becomes a war zone. And not only that, it's literally kind of happening in front of my grandparents' apartment, where I grew up, visited every summer. My family, the younger people in my family, so my cousins and my little nephews, flee and become refugees, which is also very strange. Now very common, but 2014, not so much. A strange experience. They become internally refugees in Ukraine. And in 2016, so another couple of years after, actually, your son was there covering the war as well and got in trouble, and we had to deal with that. But in 2016, it was safe enough, kind of, that I was able to visit. So I went there. I had a brother living in Moscow at the time, and we kind of went through the Russian border, which was really the only way to get in there. And the city that I knew was a city of 1 million people, so, big city. And it was very, kind of getting fancy right before this began. They hosted Euro Cup 2 years before. They built this very lovely, very fancy airport. I used to always have to take the train, and now I could fly in. This is 2012, 2013. And then what I saw was very much the opposite. There was no one under the age of 50 at all in the city streets. The lights were not working. There was martial law. There were soldiers kind of around. There were bullet holes on everything. And me and my brother, this was my brother's idea. So my brother said, well, this can't be this bad. Let's go find some underground life. Let's go find a bar. I'm like, okay, my somewhat alcoholic brother, let's go find a bar. So we found a bar. He found a bar. And we had a drink and we're talking. And then he's like, let's go find another bar. So I'm like, okay. We find another bar, except the bartender opens the door and they're like, you guys, it's 15 minutes before martial law. Martial law means you have to be home, otherwise you'll get arrested. So like, we're hurrying home, we're closing the bar, you gotta go home. And we're like, oh shit, okay. So we're trucking, me and my brother trucking through the center of Donetsk, city of a million, as I said, big city. And it's like, let's say 8:45, whatever the martial law was, I don't know. And it's dead quiet. We're the only humans on this in the center of this huge city. There's not a single car, and it's just like super quiet and bizarre. And we're hurrying, and all of a sudden, in this quiet, there's a sound, and this is the sound of shelling that we've all heard in movies, but I doubt anybody here, unless I'm wrong, heard it in real life. Well, maybe you have. It is not a fun sound to hear in real life. It sounds quite different, and it affects you quite differently. And this was obviously far away; it wasn't like next to me or anything. But it gave me a fear that I've never, like a different fear that I've ever felt before. And I think this is a fear of war. And until that point, I didn't think besides the fact that I didn't understand why, like, I need to write a World War II book, even though this story was interesting. I also didn't know how I could. I'm a younger woman living in America. I don't know what it's like to be a soldier in World War II. Like, it's just so far from my reality. But after that experience, I was like, you know what? I think I could take the seed of this little fear and grow it into what it must feel like to be thrust in a war that starts kind of overnight, very suddenly. And so I did. I began writing the book in 2007 upon moving to Berlin. Berlin carried a lot of meaning to me, and I think anybody from the Soviet Union. And there I was. And I was also 7 months pregnant, so I kind of had like a deadline. I was going to become a writer either now or never, because I was like, there was a baby. And yeah, I began writing this very long book. Apparently, so it comes out in a bunch of countries, including Germany, which is interesting, and I think speaks to the nuance that is in the book, because I keep getting questions about why I decided not to make every German character in this book an evil Nazi who screams. So there are some evil Nazis who scream, but there's also other characters who do other things.
Yeah, there's my personal pain out of many, out of the novel, and that's the moment when the major character Yefim and his dying friend Ivan got betrayed by a Belarusian survivor.
Mm-hmm.
I identify myself as Belarusian, and that's the country that been wiped out during the war. The 2 million people practically burned alive in their barns, and there's also like a terrible aftermath, and people were sent to gulags. And so I grew up in all this, an aftermath of war, and this is what I'm saying, that I didn't see the war, but I know so many things about it. So I feel somehow related. And in your book, this is true. So some of the Germans, I don't know if, my question was, did you make the anime Belarusian, and was it personal and based on their current events when Belarus is actually collaborating with Russia against Ukraine, or was it just like another juicy twist in the plot? When some of the Germans are actually good people and treat Yefim nicely, but the Belarusian survivor is the one who gives them away.
Betrays, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is, I'm really glad you asked this. one of the most, I feel like we all grow up in, people who grow up in that part of the world feel like they know a lot about the war. And then when you begin researching World War II, you realize how little you actually know about World War II, and how what you do know is very sort of specific and came to you in ways you may or may not understand. And how there's all these other stories that are actual reality if you read firsthand sources of people who were there. So one of the most shocking and unpleasant facts that I discovered in research is that so if you were captured, if you were, let's say, a POW and you're in a POW camp with a bunch of other Soviet people, and you happen to be Jewish or you happen to be a communist, anybody who the Germans are seeking out and want to destroy, you were most likely to be discovered not by the Germans themselves, by the guards, but given up by your comrades. This was very, very common, and sucks to find out, because I think we are told, and now maybe with the war between the two countries it feels more obvious, but there was always this story. There's always this story that I felt like we grew up, that we're all brothers, right? There's so many songs we hear about we're all one nation, right? That was like the story. But I think the story clearly isn't true today. But it is, I think this war is so heartbreaking because we've been told the stories over and over for so long. But it was also very not true in 1941. My theory is that Soviet Union was quite a new invention, and it encompassed a lot of people, many of whom still remembered their own country before they got, into this conglomerate. And they weren't very necessarily friendly. They didn't feel like they owed anything to each other, right? Like you put together Latvia and Uzbekistan, what do they have in common? Nothing. Literally not a single thing, like no religion, no food, no language, no. And all of a sudden they have to be like together and brothers and speak a language none of them ever spoke, called Russian, and like listen to this dude named Stalin. Like that's not right. And given that it's only been less than 20 years when the war starts, the allegiances aren't fully formed. This isn't one nation where everybody is for each other, even though they have a common enemy called the Germans. So I read a lot of firsthand accounts from POWs. It was actually the challenge of this book was that I've never heard of, I didn't know anything about POWs, but I also didn't know anything about like a Jewish POW. And so my first question is like how, which the letter does not address, is how would he even do it? Like, how do you survive if you got captured and there's Nazis around and you're Jewish and you kind of look Jewish? And so I was like, well, I can't write this book unless I find this out. So I emailed this very famous historian, and I asked him, who studies World War II, and I was like, hey, so how would it work? And he said, I have no idea. Good luck. I was like, well, great. Back to square one we go. Eventually, I found these two great historians. They're both alive. I have one of them on Facebook, who are Soviet Jewish guys. One of them lives in Israel. And they, I guess, had the same question. But they, because they're real historians, unlike me, they found other Jewish POWs who survived long enough and were willing at the end of their life to talk about how they did it. And so I found the answer to my question. There were kind of commonalities, common tricks they tended to use. And so I put the tricks into this book, even though I have no idea how my actual grandpa did it. Where was I going with this? What were they doing? What were they? Well, no, you'll have to read the book to find out, because it's sort of interesting, right? Like it's an interesting question, like how you do it. And luck is kind of oddly one of the answers, because a lot of it is luck. But I was saying that, so they were often most afraid of their comrades. That was who you had to hide your circumcision from often, because that's who would see it and give it up. And on occasion, it was a German guard that would look the other way, or a doctor that would see a circumcised man and not say anything and just let him get dressed and move on to another room. And so as I read these two interesting facts, I realized that humans are human, and even in war, there's shitty ones and good ones on either side or whatever, right? And that isn't how World War II is ever talked about or ever portrayed. It's always very like the good and the bad, and nothing in between. And I didn't think the world needs another novel that does that. And so, I also, when you read about Osterweiters, there's a wonderful podcast that came out a few years ago. It was a project of Memorial, if you guys know what that is, the organization. And they interviewed a bunch of Osterweiters that were still alive. I think there were almost all, there was a couple men, but a lot of women, these old babushka. And they talked about their kind of complicated relationship with the Germans. And also the Germans' attitude, or the Germans' experience changed, right? At first they were winning, and so they didn't give two shits about, anyone else. But when they started to lose, and they had all of these people from this part of the world they're trying to conquer around them, their attitudes started to change. Fear crept in, right? And fear is a pretty powerful emotion. I think when you're losing and things are not, you're going to be punished. And so I wanted to put all of these complicated things in there. I wrote this book before this full-scale invasion began, is the second part I wanted to say. So it wasn't because like Belarus is part of war. The Belarusian character was a real person and actually taken from this letter. And so I was like, no, let's just make it what it was.
Yeah, thank you. It just proves that it's neither on a nation level, it's on a personal level.
It is all completely
and it's
personal.
actually a historical fact that it was a version.
Yeah. And and then there's like a Pole who helped, and then a lot, like it was just so complicated. People were so mixed in many countries and places. So yeah, and then your second question was about my grandma wrote a memoir, and yay, grandma, more grandma, all grandmas should write memoirs because, and it was very helpful in seeing things that I don't think you can find in historical research, like smells. No one's ever going to tell you what Donetsk smelled like in the 50s, and it did not smell good, to summarize. Or kind of things that people think about when they're actually living through a historical period of time. I think when a historian comes in, right, they're never going to describe like the domestic worries or kind of situations of people. They're going to kind of give you this bigger picture. But a person who lived there, they can tell you about how they were worried about their husband's affair, and how if like somebody at work would find out about the affair, and this is a Soviet cover in the 50s, like there might be problems or things, something like that. That's very kind of real life, and jokes that were popular, and fears and worries, like these kind of human things. They're just gold, really. And I mean, I guess I could have made some of them up, but grandma had real stuff, and real stuff was always way better.
I agree. There's another angle to shame and fear, and this is the grandma story when Yefim supposedly had an affair with someone from his work. And
From her work.
Her work, yes, and this is exactly the words of her superior saying, like, hey Nina, be a wise woman, just accept it, close your eyes on the situation. You have kids, you need to be strong about it. Like they've been putting all the blame on the woman of the family.
Right, yeah.
And this is just like the society works. It's not only about the backgrounds of war or people who faced something terrible during the war. It's about everything. So the society, if you don't qualify as normal golden standard of it, you should keep it away from everybody.
I considered adding the board of shame because that was a thing. you sometimes, and if you
Yeah,
ended up
yeah.
on it, it wasn't good. But it didn't work really. So I was like, bored of shit.
Another question. How was it to write the love line of your grandparents in this novel?
Yeah. There's not a lot of sex scenes because that's hard. When I mean, right? Like they're characters. They're loosely based on my grandparents, but yeah, that's a tough one because yeah. But I wanted to explore the effect secrecy has on a marriage. Right? They meet at a time when there aren't very many men who have all their limbs and are sane relatively to go around. There's a lot more women. That's a problem. I mean, it's kind of still a thing, I guess, over there. But and they are married in a time where divorce isn't very common, right, in that generation. And so I wanted to. I don't know. I find relationships interesting and long marriages interesting, especially when they are complex and set against the background of a totalitarian regime that has all kinds of quirks in it. So, yeah, I don't know. That's my answer.
Have you ever thought what would your parents say if they read?
So my dad passed away, and my mom read it, and I don't know what you guys' relationship with your mothers is, but mine is such that I was definitely like, that was kind of because when my editor at some point she's like, well, this is the time that if you want to show it to your mom, this is the great time. And I'm like, no, I'm gonna wait till it comes out. But she's not in this book, so like it's not really for that reason. She's like fancy and has a fancy literary taste, and so it was more that I was afraid of, that she'd be like, this is garbage, But no, she texted, she's like, wow, I can't stop reading. This is great. So, I do think about what my dad would have, and he's actually an interesting barometer because he was a writer too, but he was a psychologist, and a well-known one. So his books are, I have them, but I don't read them because I don't understand like any of the words in it. They're all very like hard psychology words. He also wrote some poetry, but he's a barometer. I keep his portrait on my nightstand, and whenever I have doubts about, this is applicable to the book, but also to like journalists, like articles, essays I've done. And I've done some hard ones in the past 2 years about my family in the Donbass. I did a recent one for the New York Times about my decision to not tell my son that there's a war going on, and my continued dedication to teaching him Russian, despite all kinds of feelings about it. And it was a hard piece to write. It's a controversial one. You can imagine some of the responses. Well, maybe you can't imagine some of the responses, but there were some responses that I got from all kinds of sides, some good, some bad. Anyway, but whenever I just write anything and I'm kind of in doubt, I kind of like look at my dad's portrait, and if I feel like he's like, yeah, like he's kind of nodding at me, then I know that I'm all good. But if he's kind of like, Sash, making that face in my head, then I'm like, yeah, you're right. I need to work more on it. It's a weird thing. But he was, obviously he's not alive to read this, to see it, but he was somebody that I respected a lot, that I think is like 100,000 times smarter than me in many ways. And so I kind of, it's like this weird world.
I'm not really sure if you're going to read this the last extract or not. Is it your father arguing with his sister, or it's not a family member?
Yeah, so I don't love telling people that one of the kids is loosely based on my father, because it's the least loosely based. Like my dad, yes, he was a psychologist, and yes, he lived in Moscow. but because he's not here and I didn't consult him in any way, like he's very much made up, except for the scene that it was a real scene. And so I could read it. This is in 2015 in Donetsk. So before I went there, as I told you. Wait, but I have it in Russian in front of me. I'm going to read in Russian because I'm like sick of talking. And then I'll do it. Okay. This was a weird translation experience this morning because I kept cutting things out. I'm like, this audience doesn't need it. Which is weird. С приходом августа, so this is the last chapter. С приходом августовской жары в Донецк обстрелы усилились. Нина the wife, это жена Вита, ее дочь, которая уже тоже не молода. Нина попросила Виту приоткрыть балконную дверь в надежде на свежий утренний ветер, но снаружи донеслись только звуки взрывов с севера города. С тех пор, как прошлой весной появились сепаратисты, Донецк перестал быть ведущим городом, с новыми высотками, ресторанами и новоотстроенным стадионом прямо под окнами Нины, где в 2012-м играли чемпионаты Европы. Теперь это была военная зона, заполненная молодыми бездумными вояками в балаклавах и пенсионерками вроде Нины, которым некуда было больше деться. Магазины были заколочены, банки и почтамт закрыты, банкоматы отключены. Машин было так мало, что вечером с наступлением комендантского часа в перерывах между взрывами можно было расслышать, как дребезжат лампы фонарей. В свои 90 лет Нину не так поражал сам факт войны, сколько то, кто ее вел. Когда немцы вошли в Киев, это было еще понятно. Все-таки они были вражеской нацией, которые пришли завоевывать ее родину. Теперь же врагами оказались ее собратья. Спонсируемые Москвой сепаратисты пытались превратить ее город в отдельную республику. Нина считала это абсурдом. Донецк все-таки не Монако. Что было самым немыслимым, это как быстро эта война разрушала семьи, превращала друзей и соседей в заклятых врагов. Казалось, что даже ее родной сын, живя в Москве, до конца не осознает, как радикально эта война поменяла отношения между Россией и Украиной. В мае, на 70-летие Дня Победы, так называемый «Бессмертный полк» прошел колонной по Красной площади, другим российским городам и в Донецке в том числе. Интернет тогда заполонили фотографии людей с портретами родственников, воевавших в Великой Отечественной войне на фоне Кремля. Среди участников был и Путин, который нес портрет своего отца-фронтовика, хотя заявлял, что это было общенародное движение. В тот день Андрей это сын, то есть сын Нины, брат Виктора. В тот день Андрей прислал нам свое фото с шествия. На ней Андрей держал портрет молодого Ефима и его 4 братьев. За ним пестрящая русским триколором толпа. Нина и Вита были в бешенстве. «Я не хочу видеть портрет отца и дяди на Красной площади», — сказала ему Вита по телефону. «Успокойся, Виточка, это шествие не политическая акция. Ты не представляешь, какой тут добрый дух единения для всех, кто воевал», — пытался возражать ей Андрей. «Ага, единение всех и Путина тоже. Если бы ты побыл здесь под обстрелами, ты бы понял. К твоему сведению, у нас тоже сегодня был парад, и портреты ветеранов несли вместе с фото сепаратистов. Будто они тоже герои. Идиоты в нашем так называемом правительстве не могут придумать веские причины, почему молодые мальчики должны умирать на войне с Украиной. Выдумывают всякую чушь о нацистах, пытаются связать 2 войны воедино, сыграть на патриотизм. Даже собрали театральную труппу, чтобы поставить молодую гвардию. Поэтому, пожалуйста, не говори мне ни о каком единении. Это полный бред». Вот такой маленький, более современный кусочек, который, наверное, звучал бы по-другому, если бы не 2 года назад началось то, что началось. Я еще хотела добавить, что я эту книгу написала, то есть я ее начала в 2017 году и закончила на 2-й неделе, в середине февраля 2022. А потом вот пришел Йосиф Сенин, сказал мне, что все спрашивают, не знает ли он кого-то из Донбасса. Он подумал, что я единственный человек, который очень хоть как-то связан с Донбассом. Вот, говорит, Саша, пиши, сейчас нужно писать об этом. Я начала писать статью, которую послали в Нью-Йорк Таймс, примерно за неделю до войны. И потом они сказали, да, берем. Ее начали редактировать. То есть я здесь, в Калифорнии, была редакторша в Лондоне, еще какая-то редакторша в Вашингтоне. И вот так вот с утра до вечера кто-то из нас, с этим текстом работал.
Была очень хорошая.
Вот так вот несколько дней. Спасибо. Она о том, что, если вы помните, Путин говорил такую фразу, что типа, ну, мы идем типа, спасать русскоговорящих жителей. Моя русскоговорящая семья в Донецке сказала: спасибо, чувак, но нас не нужно спасать, нам вообще здесь нормально, в этой стране нашей, называемой Украиной. Вот, и я написала статью о них. И, короче, значит, вот это вот идет такая редактирование. И каждое утро, как вы помните, мы тут просыпаемся, мы последние в мире, когда узнаем, что там происходит, просыпаемся и читаем, а там какая-то ситуация сильно менялась каждый день. Да. Вот, и статья вышла через день после того, как война все-таки началась, полномасштабная. И, собственно, оттуда вышла книга, потому что там внизу был написан: Саша Василюк работает над романом про Украину. Мне позвонил агент, у меня не был агентша, а тут нужно, чтобы был агентша. Позвонил агентша. Оказалась хорошая агентша, не просто так дурочка какая-то, а такая известная. Вот. Я говорю, да, у меня, собственно, уже написан роман. Я не то, что над ним работаю, я уже его, в общем-то, закончила. Ну вот, и мы как-то так бабац сразу что-то там подписали, поговорили, и его продали, что интересно, его купили сначала в Европе. В Америке он не сразу зашел. Это всех удивило, но, наверное, это не очень удивительно, потому что для европейцев эта война была рядом. А для Америки, как всегда, такая, что там происходит. But okay, now I have to stop speaking one language and switch to other. So I read this passage that happens in Donetsk in 2015, and it's the last chapter. And it kind of describes sort of a little bit what I talked about in English. So I feel like maybe I don't really need to read it. But it talks about this parade that happened in 2015 in Moscow and many other cities, including Donetsk, but mostly Russian cities, where it was supposedly like a grassroots movement, but all of a sudden it was on Red Square and Putin was in it. And it was people carrying portraits of their like grandparents or parents who fought in World War II. And it was like grassroots honoring of this, of all of these people who lost their lives or just who fought there. And Andrei, the character who's his son, he sends a photo from this parade in Moscow where he carried the photo of Yefim and his brothers, who were all Jewish Ukrainians. And when he sent this photo to Nina and Vita in Donetsk, they were pissed. And this is a real situation. I don't think I could have made it up, and I think you can kind of hear it in the text. It sounds sort of journalistic, but they were pissed. They were livid because they were like, I don't want my Ukrainian dad carried around in Red Square, and Andrei and my dad, who because this is a real scene, I can tell you, he was kind of like, but why? But there's such like a kind atmosphere. Everybody's coming up to us and asking who these people are, and everybody's sharing. There's such joy and honor in this parade, and she's just like, oh my God, you have no idea what our reality is here in the Donbass, because we also had a parade, and we also had people who carried World War II veterans. But right next to them were people who were carrying photos of separatists who died and who started this war. Another thing I saw when I went there to Donbass is how Soviet everything looked. So all of their posters, like on the streets kind of around, looked like they were from the 1950s. Like it was just super strange. Like you didn't see that stuff in Russia at the time. But it was very visible. The whole city was, there was like a soldier leaning, like cheesily toward a child, and like a flag, sort of Russian flag. And they were kind of equating Soviet Union with Russia, but also being their own republic. It was very kind of a strange mix. But it was supposed to recall the good old nostalgic like times where everything was great in the Soviet Union. and that's, I guess, the messaging that was working on the people. I don't know, or on some people. And when I went there, I saw posters, car bumper stickers, and other posters that would say something like, "Our grandfathers made it to Berlin, and we will do it again if necessary." And this is what I was kind of talking about earlier: is that these two wars are connected and were being connected on purpose. Because nothing unites people like a national trauma, and there's not a greater cult of national trauma than World War II. I think particularly much.
Yeah, that's the trauma that never been processed, and now it's propaganda weapon, pretty much, which is extremely confusing. As you said, looking at their poster, you don't know what to think of it. Because that position, everybody is brothers, and yet they are killing each other. But 70 years earlier, they've been fighting on the same side against the bigger enemy.
Yeah. One thing, sorry, I forgot to translate for you guys there in the back, is that I wrote the book. I was finishing the book in February 2022, like basically a week or two before the full-scale invasion. And then a journalist friend called me and said that, given that I know stuff about the Donbass, I should write about it, because that's, at first, before there was this full war, it was the discussion, Putin was talking about the Donbass and like rescuing Russian speakers from the clutches of Nazi Ukraine, or whatever he was saying. So I wrote an op-ed that got published in the New York Times that said that my Russian-speaking family does not want to be liberated by Putin. Thank you very much. And it got published 2 days after the full-scale invasion began. And that's how an agent contacted me, because at the bottom it said Sasha is working on a book set in Ukraine. And then I had a book deal in multiple countries within a month, which is also a very strange thing to experience, because the worst tragedy of my life was happening while the best thing of my career was simultaneously happening, and they were very much tied together. And that's weird. But here we are. But I was writing about this war that was happening already and affected my family, when most of the world did not care about it, and then suddenly everybody cared. So there's also that aspect of it. But
Yeah, that's why I'm so happy to recommend this book, because it has so many angles. And one of the major ones is about him, who's not only the Red Army soldier, but he's a Jewish Red Army soldier. And it goes for the whole book that, like, for me, it looks like a person been labeled and sentenced to death only by his nationality. And your book covers a lot of those nuances and experiences Yevgeny had, both in the army and then in Ukraine before the army, and Soviet Union after he came back home,
Right.
pretty much. Which also has a lot of things that I would not worry about, and it looks like it's based on quite a deep research. Would you mind sharing what research do you use for?
yeah, I mean, I mentioned it a little earlier, but the World War II research, it's funny because you think like World War II would be easiest to research, because it's such a, like it's probably the most written about historical event ever, maybe.
Yeah, but also it's like
Right.
specifically about Jews.
Right, but that was, of course,
Yeah.
nobody seems to know anything about it, and generally, besides so I told you I found these two historians that interviewed Jewish POWs, so that was like a key resource for me, without which the book couldn't have existed. But then I also learned that Soviet POWs, so their plight overall, not Jewish, but all of them, it's considered kind of, if you like Google it, it's considered like the least like known part of World War II today, and it's also considered the biggest military crime in history. And so like nobody in the West knows about it. I kind of strongly doubt Germans today know about it either, honestly. And yeah, and it's also very unknown in the Soviet Union, because of course these are people who were kind of stuck between two totalitarian regimes. One wanted to destroy them very much on purpose, through starvation and through actual just killing by bullets. And they were often put, their camps were not often, but sometimes next to other or part of a bigger POW camp, but they were always separated. So all the kind of the Slavic people were always separated from any other, like let's say French, Polish, whatever POWs. And their treatment was completely different. And so I have a scene in the book where it becomes obvious to Efim how apparently POWs shouldn't be treated as awfully as they were. And that it's very much on purpose that they were trying to destroy kind of the Soviet ones. And of course, at the same time, Stalin's government didn't do anything to protect them, A, and B, when tides turned and the Red Army reconquered Germany and would encounter these POWs or Osterweiters or any Soviet citizen who was on former enemy territory, they would then have to put them through a filtration system to determine whether or not they are spies, essentially. And then they met different fate, and the numbers are very much like impossible to. There's so many sources, and they're all very different, and none of them are true. But there's a percentage. So a percentage of them were sent to the Gulag. Percentage were sent home. Percentage were sent to the army. Kind of depended on when this was happening, when if the war was still happening or it was already over. Some of them were sent actually to the Donbass. Funny enough, because there was a lot of mining to do and like all the fun, hard labor. So they all kind of met different fates, but they certainly had that stain on their record forever, which is why my grandfather decided to hide it, obviously, and why others have as well. He's not the only one who managed.
That moment in the book, I mean, we know for a fact that not a single Jewish Red Army soldier had a similar war experience, but in your book, Efim was discriminated right after he joined Red Army back in Germany. This discrimination experience, it's that's the novel fiction part, or that you know for sure that was his experience in the army.
Yeah, that was fictional. Yeah. But given what I've seen, what I've read, kind of overall, yeah, it was also interesting to research the Soviet life part of it because obviously I'm young, and I think that was my biggest fear. In fact, I was a little bit afraid of doing this event. I think my biggest fear was that some older Soviet-born man, this is like the picture I drew in my mind, is gonna I have a word, Russian mansplain is what I call it. Like that's what Putin does on an extreme, right? But it was also very common with older Russian men to tell you how you know nothing and then talk at you for an hour and tell you everything that they know.
Or Soviet maybe. Soviet too. Or Russian or Soviet.
Soviet, but also yeah. I think it's probably common in many of the republics. But anyway, so I had this vision. And so to conquer my fear, but also to fact check, because clearly like I wasn't there. I have sources and books and internet and my aunt and other people, but when the book was finished, I found a Soviet older man to read the book, who reads English, who lives here, to read the book and to tell me if I got things wrong. And he found things that were wrong, and we sat in the coffee shop here in the Malmo for like 2 or 3 hours as he went through a long list of mostly small things, some, that he corrected. And I was actually very grateful because it kind of allayed my fear that somebody's going to be like, you know nothing, little girl, anyway. So there were 2 things that he found that aren't fully correct, but they were so minor and the story was more important that I left them as is. One is like the month is wrong or something in the 1989. I'm like, no one will know. It doesn't matter. It has to be on this month for a different reason. Something like that. But
Yeah. Probably last question for me. I was gonna ask you what is this little incident with the Andre in the 90s. What's the purpose of that kidnapping episode?
yeah.
You just want to give an audience a taste of how the things were back
Yes.
then. Okay.
So my father was kidnapped in 1994. He didn't live with, my parents were divorced and he didn't live with us. And so he was kidnapped. He was like driving car, picking up a passenger to make some extra money because it's 1994 and, you know, people did that at the time. And it was some people who thought that, oh, man has car, must be rich, you know. And so they tied him to a tree in a forest. Oh, he's a psychologist. He was super poor. I literally had no money, which is why he was working to try to pick up a passenger in the first place. Anyway, and so I think I was, I don't know, let's call it 10 or something at the time. But because I didn't live with us, I didn't know that this happened. But I remember he called, and it was my mom's birthday, and he called, and there was just something off about his voice. You know how sometimes you just know something is off, you have no idea why. And I still remember like this call for whatever reason. So he called my mom, and he must have told her what happened. And after this, a few days or maybe the next day, I don't know, I was shipped to Donetsk. And this was it was like September 1st. It was the beginning of the school year. And I'm just like, what the hell am I doing in Donetsk? Like, I'm supposed to be in school in Moscow. And my mom made up some story to kind of make sense of it. But I was never told about the kidnapping. And for the next like 15 years, I lived not knowing this. And at some point, I think my dad started talking about like, oh yeah, something around the kidnapping. And I'm like, what? And so he'd forgotten that they lied to me, you know, because it's been so long. And then eventually he thought I knew. And so I just found that entire situation very interesting because I'm playing with secrets and secrecy and silence, which is such a huge part of Soviet life. I mean, every family in any country has secrets, right? But I think Soviets took it to another level. And so I gave every character a secret. Some of them are small, some of them are bigger. So yes, I partly wanted to, this was like an example of a secret that kind of is interesting. And also it represents kidnappings were not that uncommon, right? Like it was a great example of crazy ass 90s for Western readers. And I had it on hand. And I'm like, well, I might as well use the kidnapping. It appears very slightly. It's not like it actually began as a full-blown scene. And I'm like, okay, nobody needs the details. And I kind of really want to reuse it again because I feel like there's more there. Maybe next book. I don't know. So yes.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's good to know it was a real historical event.
Right.
Because like,
and interesting.
I suppose every day kind of like.
Right. No, I mean, it was so. I called my mom and I was like, hey, I'm thinking of including my dad's kidnapping, but I don't remember. What did you tell me instead to for the story to make sense? Like, why am I being shipped in the beginning of the year to my grandparents? And she couldn't remember. And so I was like, oh, damn. And then, so I had to like make up something. And actually what I think I made up is what I remembered eventually. I'm pretty sure it's true. Anyway. So,
any questions from our
or comments?
Audience?
Yes. I think one or two people maybe already read.
You're very welcome to share your family secrets here.
Yeah, that too. Yes.
Марина, можно, пожалуйста? Я хочу сказать, что я вообще очень редко, тоже в последнее время, люблю какие-то современные книги.
Я тоже.
Очень выборочно. Ваша книга произвела на меня совершенно ошеломительное впечатление. Сначала как-то мне было тяжело, ее я слушала. по многим причинам, потому как восстановлено вот это вот у нас, ну, как у многих в семье, есть несколько родственников, про которых мы, допустим, не знаем, что там было, и это настолько драгоценно, потому как вы рассказали эту историю, для меня было очень действительно необычно и невероятно ценно, что такая молодая женщина, и как-то так вот, как-то так молодой человек может так как-то понять и рассказать эту историю. И кроме того, в этой истории было столько разных углов, которые настолько важны сегодня, как умение, начиная с каких-то неожиданных, как умение видеть тех же самых немцев, так, как не всегда фашистов, да, заканчивая тем, что такое война, и этими секретами семейными, тем, как они влияют на... и перечислить не могу. То есть я очень благодарна. По-моему, это очень драгоценная, важная книга. Я очень... Спасибо большое.
Спасибо вам большое. Мне просто очень, очень приятно. Постараюсь. Потому что я... Ну, конечно, она написана по-английски. Я живу здесь. Я писала, чтобы рассказать, вот какому-то миру здесь скорее о том, что там. Но для меня было очень важно, как ее воспримет наш народ, потому что, конечно, она, собственно, для нас тоже. Мне очень жаль, что она не выходит ни на украинском, ни на русском пока. По понятным, наверное, всем причинам. Вот, но да, пока что вот ко мне как-то...
Здесь ключевое слово «пока», и все-таки она выйдет на много других языках, конечно.
Да.
Потому что нашему народу тоже нужно объяснять.
Вот да, но как бы вот с тех... Вот она вышла уже месяц, 5-6 недель, и, конечно, уже прочло много довольно народа, и мне как-то пишут, и очень тепло отзывается, и начинает своих, как это одна... Женщина начала свою бабушку, свою семью расспрашивать, и узнала очень многое, чего она не знала совсем о своих родственниках. Такой прям очень какой-то поражающий, значительный. Вот. И другие какие-то, просто как-то...
Я уверена, она коснется очень многих читателей. Во-первых, потому, какие вопросы мне поднимаются, но основной вопрос, который проходит красной линии, кроме всего прочего, который Ефим постоянно задает сам себе, который, как известно, остается без ответа. А как происходит война? Почему случается война? Как такое вообще в принципе может быть? Это происходит с ним постоянно в Германии, когда он не понимает, как в таком благосостоянии Германии, почему нужны украинские земли, в том числе и так далее. То же самое мы видим с Ниной, ситуация в конце книги, когда она тоже не понимает, как война может происходить между, в данном случае, людьми, которые говорят на одном языке. Мне кажется, как раз самое время говорить. Все, что могу сказать, спасибо.
Я шла сюда, потому что мой сын очень рекомендовал. И я, в общем-то, так думала, ну хорошо, раз он сказал, что это очень хорошая книга, и ее нужно читать, я пойду послушаю. Потому что всегда лежит вот такая стопка книг, которых нужно прочитать, и до которых руки не доходят. Ну, послушая вас, я действительно поняла, насколько важна вот эта тема именно в это время. Поэтому большое спасибо, что написали, и настолько разносторонне, многогранно. Вот именно и проблемы Советского Союза, и переходящие это все уже в современность. Вот, так что спасибо. Буду читать.
Хорошо. Спасибо, Саша. Давайте последний, может быть, вопрос, и мы будем переходить к автограф-сессии.
Да.
Вера, нет, боюсь. Окей, да, пожалуйста,
У меня
Миша.
есть вопрос.
Да.
Вот вы говорили, да, что вы живете много лет уже здесь. Сейчас, я думаю, как бы получится формулировать мой вопрос. И вы пишете, да, ваша книга о персонажах из ну, постсоветского пространства, я не уверен до конца, кто оттуда, да. Есть ли у вас какие-то способы или, не знаю, приемы, я не знаю, уместно ли это слово здесь, как-то соединяться или больше чувствовать людей оттуда, что ли? Ну, потому что мы все люди, как бы это очевидно, да, мы все испытываем страхи, да, и прочие сложные эмоции, как мы уже да, поднималась эта тема, что все, в общем, дело в человеке, а не в более машине. Ну вот есть ли у вас какой-то, в общем, способ, да, может, ментально приближаться к жизни там, да, если вы пишете о современности?
Да, вот я хотела уточнить, если вы имеете в виду
Да,
жизнь там
да,
сейчас.
не про время, да, а про именно пространство и про жизнь там.
Вы знаете, какой-то у меня такой двойной ответ. Сейчас наверное, мне ваш вопрос как-то напоминает скорее вещи, которые происходят не совсем связаны с книгой, то есть они происходят сейчас, вот прямо вот сейчас, вот 3 дня назад, например. У меня был очень интересный случай. То есть они не отражаются в тексте, может быть, но они отражаются в том, как эта книга выходит на свет, как я общаюсь с людьми, например, в Украине, например, в России. И пытаюсь продолжать верить, что мир возможен. Хотя многие, по-моему, там не верят уже в это давно. И за последнее время я как-то осознаю, насколько наша жизнь здесь, в диаспоре, и наше понимание того, что там происходит, насколько оно вот психологически отличается от того, как люди, живущие там, это ощущают. Меня не напоминает о какой-то моей наивности. У меня, я не знаю, как бы тут все, наверное, из разных мест, в общем, разные у вас отношения, разные родственники, где-то там есть или нет. Вот, но тот PTSD, который сейчас происходит с людьми в Украине, и тот, как это называется, как они там это называют в России, я уже почему-то по-английски. В общем, когда уходишь в себя, как-то internal immigration.
Внутренняя миграция.
Да, вот, да, внутренняя миграция, которая происходит с некоторыми, с моего круга общения в России, она с нами здесь, она не так сильно происходит. Может быть, как-то минимально, но в основном мы живем, мы ужасаемся, мы звоним, там, не знаю, читаем новости, но мы не видим мертвых тел там рядом с нами на дороге, или мы не ходим и боимся что-то сказать. В метро не можем там одеть чего-то или прочитать чего-то. Вот. И мы как бы, да, теоретически мы это, наверное, можем все понять, но это не совсем то, как это испытывается все-таки там. Вот. И мне это просто как-то, мне периодически какие-то общения напоминают об этом. Я приведу вам пример, потому что 3 дня назад, я как говорю, 3 дня назад я решила... месяц, началось с того, что месяц назад у моего двоюродного брата была невеста. Она убежала из-под венца, или как это называется, runaway bride. Они встречались лет 10, и я ее несколько раз видела, это был в Донецке еще. Мы с ней говорили всегда по-русски. Вот. Она такая маленькая, аппетитная блондинка, которая работала график дизайном. I'm sorry, I totally forgot the English translation. Okay, I'll be back with you guys. Don't go anywhere. Короче, в общем, месяц назад мне всплывает фотография. И после того, как она убежала из-под венца, мы с ней не общались. Но она у меня, оказывается, на Фейсбуке есть, про что я забыла. Ну, потому что я забыла немножко. Вот. И тут вдруг, как бывает, значит, знаете, фотография стоит. Это молодая девушка, Женя зовут. Она в форме украинской. Она, оказывается, в армии 2 года уже служит. На секундочку. Маленькая такая, график-дизайнер. Вот, я совершенно поражена этим фактом. Вот, и решила я 3 дня чего-то набу. Пишу. Вот, пишу по-русски, по-другому не умею. к сожалению, по-украински не пишу, не говорю. Вот, пишу, типа, вот, Жень, я тут увидела, ты, как ты, что ты вообще? Ну, вот какой-то у меня таким это тоном. В ответ текст, написанный по-украински. Типа, это зависит от того, какая у тебя позиция. Я такая, ну, какая у меня позиция, если я чего пишу? Ну ладно, все-таки война, как бы, да? Вот. Разговор продолжает происходить примерно так же. Я извиняюсь, что, слушай, извини, я не говорю по-украински. Она говорит, для меня, представьте, для меня русский язык, там, это язык смерти моих собратьев, может быть, такой вот. И все какими-то вот такими, я даже боюсь сказать, что штамповками, но вот такими вот как бы кусками текста, которые совершенно не отражают мой тон, абсолютно другим тоном. И после этого совершенно не получившийся разговор, потому что мне пришлось его как-то закончить. Ну, я там предложил помочь. Она говорит, как, чем? Я говорю, ну, не знаю, деньгами. Ну, чем, да, мы тут собираем как бы, да, периодически. И закончилось такой фразировкой, что хочешь чем помочь, вот расскажи миру, что в европейской стране в 21 веке не нужно бороться за право говорить на своем языке и верить в свою культуру. С чем я абсолютно согласна. Но меня, наверное, после этого поразил тот факт, насколько у нас не получался разговор, насколько я пыталась каким-то одним тоном, таким наивным тоном американки, которая совершенно не понимает, что, наверное, эта девушка за последние 2 года навидалась. Вот. И насколько там было не пробиться. Вот для меня это какой-то такой контраст, который меня поражает, продолжает поражать во многом. Вот. Я не знаю, вот какой-то странный ответ.
Но это очень сложно, насколько я понимаю. Ты не говоришь на украинском языке, да, несмотря на то, что ты родилась в Украине. Ты жила долго в России, теперь ты не поддержишь Россию слова вообще. Я думаю, что у нас у всех есть PTSD в той или иной степени, может быть, даже зеркальный. У кого-то, ну, не знаю, бывает, что нам с этим жить теперь всегда, потому что война произошла.
Translate for. Sorry, guys, I apologize. I see there's a thumbs up. Yeah. Anyway, but maybe I'll just tell you a different story that way. It'll sort of work. I just wrote. I think maybe I mentioned it earlier. My most recent piece was in the New York Times, and it was about not telling my son about the war. So when the war began, he was 4, and I'm like, he does not need to know about this. This is terrible. He's 4. Why? Right? He doesn't live there. He's not affected
into your grandfather's steps.
Right? While I'm writing, and exactly about that, about not telling somebody about something, right? It's crazy, right? But I'm like, he's a child. He doesn't need. I don't need to burden him with this terrible knowledge. But the child, they have a tendency to grow. And my kid used to go to a Russian language school here, where there's other Russian language parents who are also very much affected by this war, right? And at some point, he finds out about it, basically, to spoil the article. And meanwhile, this whole time, I'm teaching him Russian. But the story, when I sent it to the New York Times, it was really about like secrecy and this culture of secrecy, and how I'm kind of continuing it in this weird way, and what's the right thing to do. And the editor really wanted to emphasize the teaching my kid Russian part of it. That was sort of, I don't know. I mean, so the original core story is there, but there's just more about how I was teaching him Russian, and I wanted to take him back to Russia and Ukraine so he could meet his relatives, his cousins, and whatever. But also because I was panicking about him losing the language. And it's a struggle here, right? If you're trying to raise a bilingual kid. My husband's American, and even without that, it's just hard. It's like a constant battle, and I have to, threaten him all the time, and whatever, correct him constantly. It's just like so much work. Anyway, I'm like, what's the easiest thing to do? You go there. He sees that it's a real place, and it's not just his mom that speaks this weird language, right? It's a whole universe of millions of people, and it's the easiest linguistic form of keeping the language. But of course, war, right? So none of us have this option anymore, which is, I mean, I hear moms talk about this all the time. That's a big tragedy, I would call, for anybody who like cares about keeping the language. Anyway, long story short, the article comes out and she insists on the headline that I tell her I hate and I please don't use it. But she insists, and because of the New York Times, I kind of let her do it. And the headline is, so it comes out online first and then in print later, which is common. And the headlines are different, which is also common. So, because clickbait is a thing.
Mhm.
So the clickbaity headline was "Speaking Russian in America." Underneath that, it says Sasha Vasilyuk, and then underneath that, it says wrote a novel, said Ukraine. Right? Not a good look. And I'm like, please don't use this headline. And she sends me a few crappy other options that are way worse. And she's like, you see how this one is way better. And I'm like, She's like, listen, I'm in London. I'm in New York on book tour. The book just came out 2 days before this is happening. And I'm in New York. She's like, you go to bed and I'm going to publish it with Speaking Russian America at 1 a.m. your time. And I'm going to monitor. And if there's a pile-on of like Ukrainians hating on you or whatever, whoever, I will change it. And I'm like, okay, fine. Like, I give up. Wrong. Bad idea. Lesson learned. So the pylon did not happen right away. There was a couple of people in Ukraine on Twitter the next morning who were hating on me, but it was just a couple, and I was like, that's okay. Like, it's not a big deal. I don't need to kind of worry about it. I go on about my book tour. I come back to events in Colombia, blah, blah, blah. There's Gaza protests. There's other things happening in the world. 4 days later, I decide to Google my name and my book. And guess what I saw? A pylon on Goodreads, which is a site that hopefully none of you ever use, and no one ever should use it because it sucks. Because anybody without having bought the book or read it, or even having an ability to read it, so let's say people in Ukraine can't read this book because it doesn't exist there. You can't order it on Amazon or in any way. Anybody can go on and like say whatever about any book, you know. So anyway, there was a pylon. And it's a lot of Russian colonizer pig, is basically the verbiage used. And that is unpleasant, has been unpleasant. It's sort of stopped now, but that's the reality. And it's a reality that I'm not the only one facing. Simon had the same thing as journalists. Every journalist reporting Ukraine has had some variation of this theme, but it speaks to that same difference between kind of our slightly naive version of events and their seething anger that they really can't do much with, and so they often tend to put it in random places and against people that are, you know. So anyway.
Thank you, Sasha. If there are no more
It's a
questions,
weird thing to end on.
That's the life, okay?
That's the life, yeah.
Yeah, we have to face it. Let's thank you, Sasha.
Thank you. If you have stories to tell me, come tell me the stories. I'm happy to sign books and drink tea.
Yes, please.
Or
I think we're
wine.
gonna make a fresh batch or what?
Спасибо большое.
Пожалуйста.